Hello and welcome to Call of the Senate, a podcast presented by the Minnesota Senate DFL Caucus. Our topic today is women's history and the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm joined today by three champions for women's rights: Senator Sandy Pappas of St. Paul, Senator Jen McEwen of Duluth, and Senator Mary Kunesh of New Brighton. Senators, thank you for joining today. Today's ERA Day, so I'd like to begin our discussion there. And I'd like to hear from each of you on the ERA one by one. Senator Pappas, you've been advocating for the ERA for decades, so I'd like to begin with you. Could you please share with our listeners a little bit about what the Equal Rights Amendment is, as well as your efforts to organize around this issue?
Well, if we'd had the ERA when Ruth Bader Ginsburg started challenging discriminatory laws, she wouldn't have had to spend so much time in court. It really lays the basic requirement that women cannot be discriminated against in employment and have to be provided with accommodations when necessary. So, other states have had ERAs. We've had states that have approved the ERA, the national ERA, for decades. So it's time to get the job done.
Right. And, I believe Minnesota passed it way back in 1973, if I'm correct. And a number of other states have passed it, like you mentioned, but never quite enough to meet that high bar for the constitutional amendment. But Senator Kunesh and Senator McEwen, have you, I see your ERA yes button. Senator Kunesh, do you have any thoughts on the ERA? And can you tell us a little bit about your advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment?
Sure. Of course, I'm a first-year senator, but for the past 4 years, I've been in the House of Representatives. And during that time, I carried and championed and actually passed the bill, House File 13, that would have placed an Equal Rights Amendment into our state constitution. It would have put it on the ballot in front of the voters this past election in 2020. And that ballot statement would have read, shall the Minnesota Constitution be amended to provide that equality under the law must not be abridged or denied on the account of gender. And fortunately, that bill actually did pass off of the House floor. It did not pass off of the Senate floor. I don't even know that it got a hearing. And so that was one more attempt that to deny our rights on account of gender. And that the language of the bill that I carried uses the word gender rather than sex at the end. And that language is similar, but it's not identical to the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution that died, and though maybe not for good, when an insufficient number of states ratified it before Congress in 1982. And so we are really hoping once again to bring this back. We have so much support within the legislature, as well as our constituents. And so we'll continue to work on this until we can get it done.
Well, good. And it's continued to be, like you mentioned, an important issue at the Capitol with constituents. Today is ERA Day, and you can still see the signs around the Capitol and everyone wearing green. There's still a push for the ERA, and it's not the fight has not gone anywhere. So, no. Senator McEwen, do you have any thoughts on the ERA that you'd like to share as we get into some of the bulk of our conversation here and we get into the details later on?
Yeah, it's just been such a long time coming. I also have been a new member of the Minnesota State Senate, and I'm really pleased and thrilled to be joining into the Senate and have these amazing colleagues already having done important work over many years on advancing the cause of the Equal Rights Amendment, and just really happy to jump in and get to work alongside of them. It's just been a long time coming. It's way past time to pass this and to have this as a foundational part of the law of the land.
Senator McEwen has the resolution to Congress about the ratification. Maybe she should tell us about that, because we're very close to the national ERA being fully ratified.
Yeah, this year it's pretty exciting. It's actually the Federal Senate File 1 which is to extend that artificially kind of created deadline so that they can go ahead and they can move. So the resolution is to urge them to go ahead and move forward and to say that the Minnesota Senate and the Minnesota legislature is behind them and is asking them and urging them to go ahead and move forward. We're behind them doing that.
And if that's the case, then all the states, we have the number of states that we need to ratify, then, correct?
It's very close. I think so. Yeah.
I think Pennsylvania was the last state
yeah.
to prove it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting. We actually are very close.
So just to clarify for the listeners, is that there was an arbitrary date set on the original ERA that passed in the U.S. Congress way back in the 70s that said that I believe it was 7 years that had to be ratified by all the states. So what you're saying is that the Senate file in the U.S. Senate is proposing to get rid of that arbitrary date and just allow states to ratify it at any point. Is that right?
I believe so. Is that your understanding, Senator Pappas? That's my understanding.
Yes, that's what it does. So, and once the Congress decides that arbitrary deadline does not apply, then we have enough states to approve the constitutional amendment.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll discuss a number of topics today related to the ERA, but I also want to discuss, women's leadership, women's health access, and a number of other topics like that. And so, Senator Pappas, you're the co-founder and executive director of Forward Global Women, a nonprofit that's focused on women's leadership, among other important progressive initiatives. And what has your experience been like as the executive director of that organization, and how have you supported the leadership development of other women?
Well, this whole initiative really came out of a kind of a personal interest in the Middle East. My daughters live in northern Israel and my grandchildren live there as well. And so the whole issue of kind of peace between Israelis and Palestinians and surrounding neighbors became very personal to me. So with my partners in Jordan and Israel, we co-founded Forward Global Women. So we work with women in Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and Northern Africa as well, Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt. And right now we're doing webinars because of COVID, but we're doing an in-person training and networking and leadership development convening, bringing teams from these different countries. Our teams are made up of activists, of academics, and of women that are either in government or were in government. And now we're hoping to our canceled convening, which was supposed to be in Sevilla, Spain last summer, is being rescheduled for late summer, early fall. Fingers crossed if my partner countries get the vaccine. And then we're going to bring on a number of younger women leaders as well. And our most recent webinar we did in February did feature 2 Palestinian young women leaders on the rise. So it's been fun. It's a part-time job for me as the legislature, but it's been a really worthwhile job. I mean, we don't fool ourselves that we're going to make peace in the Middle East, but we all have to do our small part that we can on all of our progressive values.
Well, you've certainly made a contribution to those efforts and for peace in the Middle East, and I sure hope that you're.
And women are taking the lead in many cases.
Right. And, I hope that you're able to convene over the summer, because that's such an important work and plays such an important role in the development and leadership skills of women. And like you mentioned, for young women. I'd also like to ask, Senator McEwen, you're the lead author of the Protect Reproductive Options Act, also known as the PRO Act, in the Senate. I should also note that Senator Pappas is a co-author of that bill. And so what does that bill do to protect reproductive freedom in Minnesota?
Well, let me first say that I'm very proud to be the lead author of the PRO Act. I'm very pleased to talk about it. But I want to make sure that people understand that the Equal Rights Amendment is a separate issue than the Protect Reproductive Options Act. And I think that's important because, as we know, certain choices in the reproductive care spectrum include abortion. And there are some people who are fundamentally opposed to abortion access who are champions of the Equal Rights Amendment. So I just want to make sure that those are separated for those who hold different beliefs on those issues and understand that those are not They don't always have to go together. Although
That's right.
they go
Our
together
right
for
in
me,
Minnesota.
but they don't have to go together. Yeah,
In
it's an
Minnesota,
important-
our right to choice to abortion is really based on our privacy laws.
It is. And what this legislation does, the Protect Reproductive Options Act, really codifies that right to privacy in our statutory law, so that there already is a right to access the spectrum of reproductive health care in Minnesota under our court law. Our courts have found that we have a right to privacy in that area, and that's wonderful. But what this does is provide us some extra protection in our very personal decisions that we make about our reproductive health care. So it codifies that people have the right to choose or the right to refuse in regard to their own bodies and their own healthcare choices. And it really it enshrines that politicians really have no place in that very personal decision for people, that it shouldn't be me deciding for somebody else what they're going to do. It shouldn't be any other politicians deciding what an individual is going to do in regard to their reproductive health care choices. So it just really gets us to the fundamentals of these are our rights, and we're going to enshrine them in our statutory law as well as in the court.
So you mentioned health inequities there, and this ties in nextly to another topic that I wanted to ask you about, which is that you've advocated for the Minnesota Health Plan and for a single-payer healthcare program in Minnesota, and I'm wondering how you think a universal healthcare program could address inequities, particularly for women and for mothers in our healthcare system.
Well, as we've heard many times, and I don't think we can say it enough, we are the only developed industrialized nation in the world that ties our healthcare to our employment and doesn't provide healthcare as a right to our citizens. We are also the wealthiest nation to ever exist on the planet. So we really don't have any excuses for not providing healthcare as a right to the people of Minnesota and the people of the United States. And I do support Medicare for all, and I also support the Minnesota Health Plan, which is the sort of just Minnesota specific single payer health care plan that has been put forth by Senator John Marty. I think if there's ever been a time for us to rally around single payer health care, it's now. In the midst of a pandemic, we just saw this past year how millions of people lost their health care because they lost their employment because of a catastrophic event, a worldwide pandemic. And that's wrong. And there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it except for profit. So I do think, and this it does affect women and vulnerable populations more because the jobs that they're working, if they lose that job, all of a sudden they lose their health care in addition to that. So I do think that a single payer healthcare system, a system that guarantees healthcare as a right to people, that's not tied to their employment. You're never going to lose your healthcare. You're always going to be able to get the healthcare that you need. It really would be a game changer in so many ways, but especially for women's freedom and women's autonomy to be able to make their own economic decisions, to have decisions and power within their own sphere, within their families, within their jobs, within their communities, to be able to have that freedom of movement between employment, freedom, just to make fundamental choices for their well-being. So I do support the Minnesota Health Plan and single payer healthcare. I'm a big advocate of that, and I think that we're behind. We need to catch up.
Definitely. So shifting gears just a little bit here, Senator Kunesh, an important area of focus for you has been your work on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in 2018, you introduced a bill in the House to create a task force for missing and murdered Indigenous women, which passed with broad bipartisan support. Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was unanimous support. 2 years later, in December 2020, so at the end of last year, the results of that task force were published. What did you learn from that report, and what are you doing in the Senate to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Minnesota?
Well, first of all, you are correct. It did pass with 100% bipartisan support in both bodies, in the House and the Senate, which I am so thankful for. And I'm really proud to be able to do this work, and thankful for all the folks that worked on the report and gathering the information. But what it really did is that it confirmed that there is a whole lot of pain from the history of violence against our Minnesota Native women and communities, and a lot more than I even imagined, because although our American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state population, from 2010 to 2018, the data shows that 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And that just in the months of 2012 to 2020, anywhere from 27 to 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota went missing. And so it confirmed what we knew anecdotally, and provided data for creating this report, as well as creating missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. We're now calling it relatives, because we know it affects not just women and girls, but men and boys and our Two-Spirit community as well, because law enforcement agencies reported that 173 sex trafficking incidences in 2017. Of those, 20% of those victims were American Indian. And so we know that the disproportionate amount really needs to be addressed. And so what I found out is that sex trafficking continues across the state. That's one of the blaring results of this report. Just recently, there were 7 arrests in an undercover sting in the last month. And not surprisingly, 2 of them, possibly 3 of them were Enbridge Line 3 employees. And so I feel like we brought attention, we provided those connections between investigation and law enforcement, and more communication from a wide variety of jurisdictions. So we're working on getting Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Office created. I have a bill that's ready to go. We're asking for funding for support services for prevention, addressing violence, and creating safe places for the care of our communities, not just our Native communities, but the communities that find themselves embroiled in this historic violence. So resources around mental, emotional, and practical life supports. And we'll continue doing the work of investigating these sort of things.
Well, your leadership on this issue has been really important. I think you filled a void when you first began to work on this, and you've led on this, and you've really been able to unify the legislature and bringing together, like I mentioned, broad bipartisan support for this work, which is just great to see. So I also just wanted to ask you, as we start to wrap up here, we've discussed several important issues today related to women's rights, women's health, and reproductive justice. And while we're on this topic, I'd also like to address the topic of equity, specifically as it pertains to wages. So women still earn roughly 80 cents for every dollar earned by men, and this figure has likely gotten worse because of the pandemic. So what can the government do? What can the state government do to ensure that women enjoy equity both in the workplace on a day-to-day basis, but also on payday?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that women make about 80% of what men do, and it's probably worse post-COVID. But it's even worse for women of color. The pay gap is even significantly wider. Those wage gaps remain despite the passage of legislation that we've all worked so hard for or to support. There's the Equal Pay Act that was way back in 1963, and it's still not being fully implemented. And so we have to work even harder, especially here in Minnesota, so that women are receiving equal pay for equal work. And they're just not, let alone equal pay for the kind of value that they come out of it. So what can we do? Well, we can add that ERA statement to our Constitution. So equal pay is enforceable by Constitution for all workers, not just women. We can pass paid family leave, because we know that a far greater proportion of women have had to cut back or generally cut back or interrupt their time in their paid workforce to deal with family responsibilities. And one of the statistics that I remember is that 15 years after graduating college, male business school graduates are making 75% more than their female graduates, unless those women had no children and rarely took any time off. So if you were willing to forego your family and take less time off, maybe you would make some equal pay than to a man. And so we have to address factors that are going to impact women's decisions, like workplace discrimination, a lack of women-friendly policies and resources in the workplace, specifically, for the unique responsibilities of women. Those persistent stereotypes that steer women and men towards different education. So really ensuring that we are encouraging girls as well as boys to go into some of the less usual professions. We have to make sure that there is adequate information around training and different career paths. And of course, we have to address the myriad forms of sexism that are both subtle and blatant in our society.
And Luke, we did take a mini step forward in 2014 when we passed the Women's Economic Security Act, so that all businesses doing business with the state have to certify that they are paying women comparable to what they're paying men. So it can't just be in the same job, but in like jobs that are rated the same. So that's been really important to make that statement as a state. But I did want to share something with the audience that I found, and that is how far we've come. So in 1914, a New Mexico court noted that in the old common law, women were incapable mentally of exercising judgment and discretion and were classed with children, lunatics, idiots, and aliens. Bad words, all of them. Similar stereotypes had to be overcome to win the 19th Amendment, which was women's right to vote, to serve as jurors, to own property, to inherit equally, to serve in public office, to own credit cards, to keep their own names, and the list goes on. The Equal Rights Amendment would have taken care of all of those things.
All of them.
I just want to thank all of you for joining today. I really enjoyed the conversation. What a fantastic episode today. And I hope to have all three of you back on the podcast at some point again in the future. So thank you.
And I'm really thrilled to be working with my new colleagues, Senator McEwen and Senator Kunesh. They add a lot to the Senate.
Thanks so much for having us. This has been really fun.
Yep.
Great.
It's a good way to start the morning.
Yeah. Thank you, Senators. Thanks for joining us today on Call of the Senate. Find us online at senatedfl.mn or on social media under the username @SenateDFL. See you next week.